What happens when a volcano that has been erupting on and off for 500,000 years suddenly speeds up? Not just a little, but in a way that volcanologists describe as behaviorally anomalous, a phrase they don't use casually. What happens when the intervals between eruptions compress, when the pauses get shorter and shorter, until the mountain is essentially not pausing at all? And what does that mean for the nearly 1 million people who live in its shadow, who go to sleep each night with an active stratovolcano visible from their bedroom windows? For 22 consecutive days, Mount Etna has not stopped. That's the number you need to hold in your mind as we go through this together. 22 days of sustained paroxysmal activity, a run of volcanic behavior that has no clear parallel in the modern monitoring record for this volcano. Ash clouds have repeatedly breached the upper atmosphere over Sicily, forcing the suspension of flights in and out of one of southern Europe's busiest regional airports. Farmers across eastern Sicily have watched grey fallout coat their harvests. Coastal communities have had ash on their doorsteps daily. And the question scientists at the Istituto Nazionale di Geofisica e Vulcanologia's Osservatorio Etneo in Catania, known as INGIVOE, are wrestling with right now is not whether this eruption will eventually end. It will. The real question is whether the system is in the process of reorganizing itself into something more energetic than what we've been used to. And that distinction matters enormously. So, what is actually happening inside this mountain right now? Why has a volcano that has always been active suddenly become, in the clinical language of volcanology, persistently paroxysmal? And if the escalation continues, if the next event steps up rather than down, what does that mean for Sicily, for Mediterranean aviation, for the crops that feed millions? Let's work through the science, the history, and the very real conditional scenarios that researchers are modeling right now. To understand why this 22-day run is alarming, you first have to understand what you're actually looking at when you look at Mount Etna. It is, by every meaningful measure, a colossal geological structure. At 3,357 meters above sea level, that's roughly 11,014 feet. It is the tallest active volcano in Europe, not just the most famous, the tallest. Stromboli, the other great active Sicilian volcano, sitting on the Aeolian Islands to the north, reaches barely 924 meters. Vesuvius, the volcano that buried Pompeii and still looms over Naples, stands at only 1,181 meters. Etna dwarfs both of them. It is, volumetrically, one of the largest volcanic structures in the entire Mediterranean basin, built up over approximately 500,000 years of eruptive activity layered upon itself like geological sediment. Now place that mountain in its human context. Directly downslope to the southeast, at the base of Etna's southeastern flank, sits Catania, Sicily's second largest city, with a metropolitan population that approaches 1 million people. 1 million people living in the direct ash dispersal corridor of an actively erupting stratovolcano. Catania's Fontana Rossa Airport, officially Catania Fontana Rossa International, one of the 10 busiest airports in all of Italy, operates just kilometers from the volcano's base. During significant Etna eruptions, ash plumes can reach that airport within minutes of becoming airborne, depending on wind direction and eruption intensity. We'll come back to the aviation implications, because they are significant, and they are already being felt during this current 22-day event. Beyond Catania, the geographic exposure is broad. Messina, on the northeastern tip of Sicily, across the Strait of Messina from mainland Calabria, sits within range of Etna's ash dispersal under easterly wind conditions. Palermo, the Sicilian capital on the island's northwest coast, is further removed, but not immune when eruption columns reach the upper troposphere. More immediately affected are the smaller communities ringing Etna's slopes: Nicolosi, Zafferana Etnea, Linguaglossa, Santa Venerina, towns that sit inside what volcanologists call the proximal hazard zone, the area where lava flows, pyroclastic density currents, and tephra fall pose the most direct threat. Then there's the agricultural dimension, which doesn't get nearly enough attention. Eastern Sicily is not just a place where people live near a volcano. It's a working agricultural landscape of enormous economic and cultural value. The citrus groves that produce some of Italy's most prized lemons and blood oranges grow on Etna's fertile lower flanks. Fertility. That is, somewhat ironically, a direct product of millennia of volcanic soil enrichment. The pistachios of Bronte, a town perched on Etna's western flank at roughly 900 meters elevation, are protected under EU designation as one of Italy's premium specialty foods. Bronte produces pistachios of a quality and flavor profile that no other region can replicate, precisely because of that volcanic terroir. A sustained ashfall event doesn't just inconvenience those farmers. It can contaminate a season's harvest, damage tree canopies, and in extreme cases, acidify soils in ways that take years to correct. This is what's at stake geographically and economically. Not an abstract geological event happening somewhere remote. A sustained volcanic escalation sitting directly on top of one of Italy's most economically active regional hubs, with ripple effects spreading outward across the entire island. So how does it work? What is actually driving this 22-day run of paroxysmal activity, and why has it persisted in a way that defies the normal on-off pattern that characterizes most of Etna's historical behavior? The activity is concentrated at what volcanologists call the southeast crater. The SEC, as it's referred to in INGVOE monitoring bulletins. Of Etna's 4 main summit craters, the SEC has been the most explosively active over the last several years. It's the youngest of the summit craters, having formed relatively recently in geological terms, and it has shown a propensity for the most energetic style of eruption Etna produces, lava fountaining. During a typical Etna paroxysm, the SEC generates lava fountains that can reach 500 to 1,000 meters in height. In the most intense events on record, those fountains have exceeded 1,500 meters, nearly a mile of incandescent magma hurled vertically into the Sicilian sky. That's not a slow, effusive lava flow. That's a dynamic, explosive release of gas-charged magma. And here's where the chemistry becomes critical. Etna's magma is classified as basaltic to basaltic andesitic in composition. That's the technical term. But what it means in practical terms is that this is magma with moderate silica content, somewhere in the range of 47 to 52% by weight. Think of silica content as the viscosity dial on the magma. High silica magmas like those at supervolcanoes are thick, stiff, and resistant to gas escape, which is why supervolcano eruptions are so catastrophically explosive. Etna's magma is at the lower end of that silica range, which makes it comparatively fluid. And that fluidity is why most Etna eruptions are effusive rather than Plinian. But fluid magma is not safe magma. It still carries dissolved gases, primarily water vapor, carbon dioxide, and sulfur dioxide, that are under intense pressure at depth. When that magma rises quickly enough, those gases don't have time to escape gradually. They exsolve rapidly, violently, launching the magma upward in a fountain. The INGVOE monitoring team in Catania has published detailed analyses of the degassing signature they're seeing during this current event. Sulfur dioxide emissions, SO2 flux, measured in tons per day, have remained elevated throughout the 22-day period, at levels that indicate sustained magma ascent from depth. In previous periods of high Etna activity, SO2 flux has been recorded at between 5,000 and 15,000 tons per day. During paroxysmal phases, figures that are, for context, higher than many of the world's largest industrial emitters on their peak days. What's different in this current episode is the persistence of that flux. It hasn't dropped back to baseline between events the way it normally does. Researchers at the University of Catania, who collaborate closely with INGVOE on eruption dynamics, have described the current activity in terms of what they call a high flux conduit state. Think of Etna's magma plumbing system like a municipal water main that's been running at low pressure for months, and then someone opens the upstream valve fully. The pressure differential forces material through the system faster than the conduit can equilibrate, and instead of slow, steady flow, you get surges. Each surge is a paroxysm. Normally, the system re-equilibrates between surges, pressure drops, and you get a pause. What we're seeing right now may indicate that the upstream supply, the deeper magmatic source, is feeding material into, The system faster than the surges can discharge it. The conduit is staying pressurized between events rather than depressurizing, which is why the intervals between paroxysms have compressed to the point of apparent continuity. Every time one of these paroxysmal events reaches a certain threshold of column height and ash production, INGVOE issues a VONA, a Volcano Observatory Notice for Aviation. These notices go directly to aviation authorities across Europe, including the Volcanic Ash Advisory Center in Toulouse, VAAAC Toulouse, which is the designated international authority for ash cloud tracking and airspace advisories across European and North African airspace. During the current 22-day event, VAAC Toulouse has issued repeated advisories covering ash dispersal at flight levels ranging from FL050 to FL350. That's roughly 5,000 feet to 35,000 feet, the full spectrum of commercial aviation cruising altitudes. The eruptions occurring during this window have been categorized as VEI1 to VEI3 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. That might sound modest. The scale runs from 0 to 8, but a VEI3 from Etna produces eruption columns that can reach 10 kilometers in height, injecting fine ash into the lower stratosphere where it persists for days and disperses across thousands of square kilometers. That is not a local nuisance. That is a European aviation management problem. But that's not the worst part of the scientific picture. The aspect that INGVOE researchers are watching most carefully right now isn't the paroxysms themselves. Those are measurable, trackable, and in a limited sense, predictable within windows of hours to days. What's harder to predict, and potentially more consequential, is whether the ongoing high flux state could eventually generate conditions for a flank eruption. And that changes the hazard profile entirely. To understand why, you need to go back in time. Because Etna hasn't just been erupting for 22 days. It's been erupting, in various forms, for 500,000 years. And that history contains the answers to some of the most urgent questions about what this mountain is capable of. The year 1669 is the reference point that Sicilian volcanologists return to repeatedly when discussing worst-case scenarios. In that year, Etna produced what remains the most destructive eruption in recorded Sicilian history. A flank fissure opened on the mountain's southern slope on the 11th of March, and over the following weeks, a massive lava flow advanced southward towards the coast. It didn't move quickly. Lava flows rarely do. But it moved relentlessly. 15 communities were partially or fully destroyed. The lava reached the walls of Catania itself, breached the city's fortifications, and destroyed a significant portion of the city before flowing into the harbor and partially blocking it. Contemporary accounts, documented by Sicilian historian Ottavio Gaetani, and preserved in historical records that INGV researchers have studied extensively, describe the ashfall, the ground tremors, and the slow, inexorable advance of the lava front that residents could see but couldn't stop. The death toll is estimated at approximately 12,000 people, 12,000 lives lost over a period of roughly 4 months to a single Etna eruption. For context, that figure represents a significant fraction of the entire population of Catania at the time. This wasn't a peripheral disaster. It was civilizational scale destruction for a regional population. Then there was 1928. The village of Mascali, on Etna's lower northeastern flank, was completely destroyed when a lava flow from a flank fissure advanced into the settlement in November of that year. Unlike 1669, there were no fatalities. The population was evacuated in time. But the village itself, including its church, its streets, its buildings, was entirely buried under lava. The modern town of Mascali was subsequently rebuilt nearby, but the original settlement is gone. Permanently. Entombed under solidified basalt. In 1992, Etna threatened the town of Zafferana Etnea during an extended flank eruption that drew international attention. Italian authorities, working with the US military, attempted a pioneering lava diversion operation, using explosives to break open the side of a lava tube and redirect the flow away from the town. The intervention was partially successful, and Zafferana was largely spared. But the episode exposed just how limited the options are when a lava flow is advancing toward a populated area. You can divert, but you can't stop. Then came 2002 and 2003, when a major flank eruption on both the northeastern and southeastern flanks simultaneously caused the collapse of the SEC's eastern flank, produced enormous ash columns that forced extended closure of Catania Fontana Rossa Airport and destroyed tourist infrastructure on the mountain slopes. The economic impact ran into hundreds of millions of euros. And in 2021, Etna set a record that INGVOE has cited repeatedly as context for the current event. 50 paroxysms in a single year, the highest annual total in the modern monitoring era. That record, set just 4 years ago, is now being tested by a run of activity that, if it continues, at its current pace, could exceed even that extraordinary benchmark. Consider for a moment what it's like to work in the middle of all of this. An engineer at the INGVOE monitoring station above Nicolosi, one of the sensor relay points on Etna's southern flank, describes the experience of working a night shift during an active paroxysm as operating in a world that has been turned slightly wrong. The infrasound sensors are screaming data. The seismographs are tracing wave after wave of volcanic tremor. And outside the station windows, the sky above the SEC is lit from beneath. Orange and red against the darkness, a column of incandescent fragments rising above the summit. It's not frightening in the way outsiders might expect. It's overwhelming. The data is everywhere, and you're trying to make sense of it in real time, knowing that what you report in the next hour might determine whether airports close, whether communities are warned. That's the then versus now that matters most. In 1669, there was no monitoring, no seismic network, no gas sensors, no satellites tracking thermal anomalies from orbit. The people of Catania had their eyes and their feet, and by the time the lava reached the city walls, there was nothing left to do but watch. Today, INGVOE operates one of the most sophisticated volcano monitoring networks on Earth, and yet the 22-day escalation we're watching has still outpaced early predictions. That gap between monitoring capability and predictive precision is where the real danger lives. The monitoring architecture INGVOE has deployed around Etna is genuinely impressive in its density and sophistication. The seismic network consists of more than 60 stations distributed across the volcanic edifice and surrounding region, capable of detecting tremor events at magnitudes well below what human beings can feel. During paroxysmal episodes, seismic tremor amplitude, the background noise level of the volcano's internal activity, rises measurably hours before the eruption peaks. This gives INGVOE analysts a predictive window, typically in the range of 1 to 6 hours, to escalate alert levels and trigger aviation notifications. Infrasound monitoring adds a complementary layer. Etna's eruptions generate powerful low-frequency pressure waves in the atmosphere, sounds below human hearing range, that propagate outward from the SEC and can be detected by sensors at distances of tens to hundreds of kilometers. The infrasound signal shape and intensity help analysts characterize the eruptive style in near real time. Effusive versus explosive, low column versus high column. During the current 22-day event, the infrasound arrays have recorded persistent elevated signals that don't drop between visible eruptive phases, suggesting the conduit is maintaining active gas flux even during what appear from the surface to be quieter intervals. Tilt networks, arrays of clinometers buried in the volcanic edifice, track minute deformation of the mountain's flanks. When magma moves upward through the conduit system, it inflates the surrounding rock, and that inflation is detectable as a tiny outward tilt of the surface. INGV has reported that tilt signals during this current event have shown a pattern of incomplete deflation between paroxysms, meaning the mountain isn't fully re-equilibrating to its pre-eruption geometry before the next surge begins. This is one of the key observational pillars supporting the high-flux conduit hypothesis. The mountain is telling its instruments that it hasn't finished moving magma. Gas flux monitoring, both from ground-based FTIR spectrometers and from satellite instruments, including those operated under the EU Copernicus Emergency Management Service, provides continuous SO2 mass flux data. The EU Copernicus Sentinel 5P satellite has been particularly valuable during this event, providing daily integrated SO2 column measurements across the downwind dispersal plume that extend the monitoring footprint far beyond what ground instruments can capture. According to data accessible through the INGV Bulletin archives, SO2 flux has remained above 5,000 tons per day for multiple consecutive measurement windows, a figure that, sustained over 22 days, represents a total sulfur release, with measurable implications for atmospheric chemistry over the central Mediterranean. VAAC Toulouse, the European Volcanic Ash Advisory Authority based at Météo France, has been issuing volcanic ash advisories, VAAs, at a pace during this event that aviation authorities across the continent have described as operationally taxing. Each VAA triggers a cascade of responses from national aviation authorities, airport operators, and airlines. Catania Fontanarossa has experienced multiple ground stops and partial closures. ENAC, Italy's civil aviation authority, has issued repeated directives, and it's worth noting that night eruptions, which are particularly difficult to monitor visually, and which have characterized several of the paroxysms in this current sequence, present specific challenges for the warning pipeline. When an eruption escalates rapidly after dark, the lag between eruption onset, VONA issuance, VAAC advisory generation, and airline operational response can run to 90 minutes or more. In that window, aircraft can be in the dispersal corridor of an ash cloud before the advisory reaches flight operations centers. The head of INGVOE has stated publicly that the current sequence requires continuous staffing at elevated alert levels, and that the monitoring team is, in effect, in a sustained operational sprint, not the normal rhythm of watch and wait that characterizes quieter periods. That's a significant institutional statement. It means that the people who know this volcano best are treating the current behavior as requiring maximum vigilance. And they're right to. Because if we run conditional models forward from the current state, and this is where we have to be precise about uncertainty, the scenarios range from manageable to genuinely disruptive at a European scale. If the current paroxysmal sequence remains at VEI 1 to 2, which is the most probable outcome based on frequency distribution data from previous Etna sequences analyzed by INGV and published in the Journal Bulletin of Volcanology, the primary impacts will continue to be aviation disruption, agricultural ash contamination, and elevated health risk from particulate matter in downwind communities. Those are serious effects, but they're not catastrophic in the civilizational sense. If, however, the system escalates to a sustained VEI3 event, which is within the documented behavioral range for Etna and which cannot be ruled out given the current high-flux conduit state, the picture changes considerably. A strong VEI3 from the SEC could produce an eruption column reaching 10 to 15 kilometers above sea level, injecting ash into the lower stratosphere where upper-level winds can carry it across hundreds to thousands of kilometers of airspace within 24 to 48 hours. VAAC Toulouse modeling for such a scenario, based on protocols established after the 2010 Eyjafjallajökull crisis, suggests that ash dispersal at flight level could trigger closures affecting more than 40 airports across Italy, Malta, Tunisia, Greece, and potentially parts of the Western Balkans. The 2010 Eyjafjallajökull disruption, which came from an Icelandic volcano with a VEI of just 4, grounded more than 100,000 flights and cost the aviation industry an estimated 1.3 billion euros in a single week. A sustained VEI3 from Etna, positioned much closer to the heart of European airspace, could produce a disruption of comparable or greater economic magnitude. For Catania Fontanarossa specifically, a high-column VEI3 event under unfavorable wind conditions could force a closure measured in days rather than hours. The airport handles approximately 10 million passengers annually, roughly 27,000 per day. Each day of closure means not just economic disruption for the airport, but for the entire Sicilian tourism and logistics supply chain that depends on air connectivity. The agricultural consequences of a sustained high-intensity ashfall event are harder to model precisely, but researchers at the University of Catania's Department of Biological, Geological, and Environmental Sciences have published assessments suggesting that heavy tephra deposition on citrus and pistachio crops during the harvest season, which for Bronte pistachios runs from September through October, and for blood oranges from November through March, could reduce yields by 30 to 70% in the most heavily affected zones. Ash-laden citrus fruits can't be sold without extensive cleaning, and even cleaned produce may carry trace volcanic compounds that complicate export certification under EU food safety standards. There's also the Strait of Messina dimension. The strait is one of the Mediterranean's most strategically important maritime passages, linking the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Ionian Sea, and carrying significant commercial shipping traffic. A major Etna eruption, generating ashfall, and potential seismic activity along the volcanic complex's eastern flank could disrupt ferry operations between Sicily and mainland Calabria, the primary surface transport link between the island and the Italian peninsula. If air and sea connections are compromised simultaneously, Sicily's effective connectivity to the rest of Europe is severely reduced, with cascading effects on supply chains, medical supply logistics, and emergency response capacity. Now, what should we actually take from all of this? First, uncertainty is real, and it is central. Scientists at INGVOE cannot tell you exactly when this 22-day escalation will end. They cannot tell you with certainty whether the next paroxysm will be larger or smaller than the last. The volcanic system doesn't operate on a human schedule, and anyone who tells you otherwise is not working from the science. What researchers can do, and are doing continuously, is narrow the probability distributions, update hazard assessments in near real time, and provide the warning lead times that allow aviation authorities and civil protection agencies to respond before impacts materialize. Second, the monitoring infrastructure that exists today is genuinely extraordinary compared to anything previous generations had. The INGVOE network, the VRC Toulouse advisory system, the EU Copernicus satellite constellation, these are not decorative institutions. They are the infrastructure that converts a 500,000-year-old geological hazard into a manageable, communicable, warnable event sequence. That infrastructure is under sustained operational stress right now. Third, the 22-day escalation we're watching is not a routine spike in an otherwise quiet system. It represents a behavioral shift that, even if it resolves without further escalation, provides a critical window for researchers to study the conditions that produce sustained high-flux conduit states. The data being collected by INGVOE right now, in real time, will inform hazard models for years to come. What comes next for Etna is something researchers are actively debating. There's a scenario involving potential eastward flank instability, a structural vulnerability that University of Catania geomorphologists have been studying for over a decade, that we haven't even had time to get into today. That subject deserves its own full treatment, and it connects to some of the most alarming long-term hazard assessments ever published about this volcano. If you're following the science of geological hazards, and you should be, stay with this story. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And if you want to understand the full scope of what Etna is capable of at its outer limits, consider what the researchers who've spent their careers inside this mountain's monitoring network say when they talk about what keeps them up at night. It's not what has already happened. It's the scenarios they're still modeling. That's where we're going next. Etna is not going to stop. It never has. The question is, always, whether we're paying close enough attention to understand what it's saying before it says it at full volume.